Hello and welcome back, and today we're going to continue looking at those brand new Synology hard drives for NAS, the HAT5300. And of course, as mentioned in my other video, I do want to compare them against some of the top ranges of hard drives currently available for NAS. Now, we'll be covering all of them, but the reason I'm going straight into WD Red Pro first is it's one of the brands that we've talked about across this channel since the early days. They were one of the first brands to differentiate their hard drives towards both NAS and non-NAS utilization, and then it only went from there. And they were also one of the first brands to embrace the idea that even within NAS there were subgenres when they released the WD Red and WD Red Pro series. So I wanted to touch on them first. But before we go any further, let's get a quick disclaimer straight off the bat. I am trying to be as completely unbiased as possible in this. However, there's a few things we have to bear in mind. One, this is a channel about NAS, and therefore I am going to be focusing quite a lot on Synology's hardware throughout the course of this video. I'm going to try to remain as impartial as possible, but I do think a lot of the decision-making process between choosing between Synology NAS hard drive and any other brand, the fact that a lot of these drives are going to go in potentially a Synology NAS system is going to play a big part, and we have to address that, and I'll try to leave it out as much as possible, but it will play its part. Secondly, it's worth bearing in mind that with these drives, they are exceptionally new and we still don't have the Synology drives here. So this comparison is to be treated as an early comparison where we are looking at the specifications provided from both brands. We aren't going to be looking at any of my testing from WD Red Pro personally. In all of our comparisons and testing, we are only going to be using their own branded data sheets and their own branded figures where they are comparable. If they're not comparable, we're not using them. We will, of course, be bench testing these drives side by side inside Synology NAS systems and maybe even non-Synology NAS systems as well later on to get some real hard, real-world bare metal data. But for now, that is what we're using for this test. And if that's not really what you're into, or you want to hold out for the real concrete stuff, I completely understand. Thanks for watching. But for the rest of you, let's get straight on with it. Let's go with the main ways in which people are going to compare these drives. And I know it is base. I know it is basic, but we've got to talk about price. Even though both of these drives in the Synology HAT series and the WD Red Pro series are enterprise kind of targeted, they are business targeted for the most part. It's, price has a price, and once you go down that road of populating 12, 16, 24 bay systems across multiple rack mounts, these numbers do add up. Now, I'm pleased to say that both of these drives have a near enough identical price tag. At the 8 TB mark, they are near enough identical. And even when you go into the 12 and the 16 TBs, the difference is single or barely into double digits. Of course, once you add these drives in larger quantities, that adds up. But even that number that it adds up to isn't a vast amount. So even though the Synology NAS hard drives do have a pinch of an advantage in terms of the actual price figure, it has to be said that that advantage is very, very small. However, we have to move from price into value, because that's a very important point. Because the WD Red Pro and the Synology range of hard drives here is actually quite an unfair comparison in one way, and that is that the Synology range of hard drives are actually more data center, more enterprise based, something that's going to come out more and more throughout this comparison. Whereas the WD Red Pro series is more for large scale NAS deployment. And WD themselves volunteered that if you are going towards those larger SAN arrangements and stuff like that, and these real, hyperscale environments, that's when they recommend UltraStar and they recommend WD Gold. Why am I comparing these drives? As mentioned, because the price tag is the same, but at the same time, the Synology HAT series at the same price is arriving with a few little bits underneath the bonnet that I would argue are data center class. So again, same price, but you are kind of getting better value for the Synology overall for what you're getting for your money. Now let's break it down into what you're getting for that money there. Let's go into the hardware. Now, they do have quite a lot in common. They're both conventional magnetic recording drive, or PMR drives, or however you want to refer to it. There's no shingle magnetic recording here, drive managed or otherwise. They are also 7200 RPM, both of them utilizing, that contained 3.5-inch chassis there with either 256 or 512 megabytes of cache, depending on the capacity throughout them. The larger capacity obviously has the larger amount of cache there to maintain that performance threshold. They both have 512 sectors internally, so again, very similar playing field there in terms of your data and the blocks that are going to be utilized internally of your system and how that translates into the hard drives themselves. Now, in terms of performance across the drive capacities, we do have a difference there. With the Synology series, looking at my notes, at 230, 242 and 262 megabytes per second performance respectively, across the 8, 12 and 16 TB there. I'm sure it's on screen. On the WD Red, we do see 235, 240 and 259 on those respective capacities. But that's a very important distinction there, the respective capacities. Because currently, at launch, there's only these 3 capacities from Synology available, with WD Red Pro obviously being around a great deal longer as a series, available in 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 18 terabytes of storage, which is very, very important for a number of people that are scaling the performance of their hardware against the capacity. So, for example, someone that has an 8 or 12 bay device may choose to have a lower capacity so they can get higher quality drives. That's one of the ways in which a lot of people kind of distinguish their budget and break things down into making a scale up there for what they get on their return. Something you don't really get with the Synology range at this time, because the range is actually quite small. It is early days, but it's an important comparison to be made between them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in terms of hardware that the WD drive is better. It's been around for a long time, and I do think it's worth highlighting at this juncture that, as we've discussed lightly in the previous video and in the articles, if you look in the links below, the Synology architecture of these hard drives, they haven't built these drives. Don't think Synology have released a drive and you're thinking, well, WD have been in this for decades. Where have Synology been here? They are using Toshiba drives in the MG series, the 678. These drives here have got that Synology, the Toshiba Endurance drive for their Synology firmware inside. The result being, once you look at those drives, and if you look at things like Backblaze with their AFR ratings, if you look at these Toshiba drives independent of Synology, then you do see they are a very robust drive with an impressively low failure rate there. Backblaze last year, I think it was the 16 TB, had it rated at 0%. Yes, the quantities are scalable, and Backblaze, as figures go, is relative to the number of drives they test and the extent of the testing, but they still gave it quite a high regard there. Now, I said I wouldn't mention anything that doesn't compare them directly. I didn't really want to reference that because WD Red Pro doesn't really feature on that list, so just chucking it out there, but we can't really count it into the comparison there. Moving forward from that, we can talk about where that hardware lives in terms of your long-term storage, endurance, durability, and stuff like that. Now, Synology talked a big game about the endurance and durability of this new range of drives, which is when you look at the architecture, it's another kind of marker of where you can see these drives are pushing higher into that product kind of family of hard drives that you can get for servers these days, DAS, NAS and SAN. And one of the biggest tells of that is a 550 TB workload rating. Generally, a lot of places will measure by the TBW, terabytes written, and that can be annual or a whole figure produced over the lifespan of the entire drive and then divided over the warranty period. But still, 550 terabyte workload is nearly double that of the 300 terabyte workload of the WD Red Pro series there, which is a huge distinction there. And by workload, this isn't a question of you can put 550 terabytes a year on this drive. These drives are 8, 12 and 16 TB. That figure responds to data being placed on these drives and more data and recycled and moved, gotten rid of. Basically a recycle of that drive, just how much data can go on this drive in its lifetime annually. So again, a much more impressive figure there from that drive. It should also be mentioned that the Synology drives do make less noise apparently. And again, a lot of these figures we've had to ascertain from the Toshiba range that they're based on, but they do seemingly make a pinch less noise than that of the WD Red Pro. Red Pro drives have had, people have noted about noise on drives in the past there, and that is something that people, do bring up when it comes to any Pro Series drives. But in this direct comparison, and once we look at the idle and seek figures, we can see that the WD Red Pro, on the whole, is a pinch noisier. Now, let's be honest, noise in a drive in this environment, it means nothing really in the grand scheme of things. If you look at a noisy drive like this, drives that are designed for, again, 8, 12, 16, 24 base systems and larger, you're not even going to hear those drives over the massive multi-tiered cooling systems that rack mounts have, over 2 redundant power supplies, over the server room that they are in and the cabinet they live and reside on. What I'm saying is these Synology drives being a pinch quieter ultimately means nothing in the environment they will be deployed in. Now, the WD Red Pro drives, both of these drives have got a 5-year warranty, it should be added, utilises less power on the whole, both on active and in idle. Generally will utilise a pinch less power, which I'm not talking, you guys out there keep an eye on the lecky bill. I'm talking more about people who are worried about degradation on components and heat generated by power consumption. The WD Red Pro drives seemingly use a pinch less power, but once again we do have to bear in mind a high-end NAS drive versus a borderline data center class drive. So they're going to be different in that architecture. So that has to be factored in. But in terms of the endurance and durability, it has to be mentioned that whenever Synology have talked about sustained performance on these drives, when they have talked about thousands of hours of combined utilization, that these are drives that can only work within a Synology system. I said at the beginning of the disclaimer, I wasn't going to lean too heavy on this, but it needs to be addressed. The Synology NAS drives have to be used in a NAS system. And that's a two-way street. They are saying that the newest generation of UC, SA, FS, and the XS series, the newer generations such as the 3 that were launched in the last 48 hours, these drives can, those systems can only be used with Synology hard drives. If you use non-supported hard drives, they cannot support your warranty there. They're not able to provide the support of that 5-year warranty. And with the Synology NAS hard drives, that is still true. These drives, the HAT5300, if you use them in a non-Synology system and they fail or you encounter problems, you are using an unsupported setup and therefore your warranty cannot be supported by the brand. That is their position on this. That, for a lot of people, is going to be a bit of a deal breaker there, because the WD Pro series can be used, again, in Synology, in QNAP, in QSAN, in HP. It can be used in Promise, lots and lots of systems. Now, of course, you're not going to be chopping and changing these drives. If you were going to buy a Synology NAS system anyway, it's a material, but there's still no avoiding that if you are looking at repurposing drives within that 5-year cycle, whether these drives are going to be moved to another system and you resync them out after a couple of years with newer drives and repurpose those old drives somewhere else to maximize your investment, you are going to potentially remove your warranty coverage on those drives. So it's definitely worth considering that in terms of endurance and endurability of these drives, because Synology are providing great figures on what these drives can do, but it is within a Synology NAS system with Synology firmware on those drives that are designed together, which leads us neatly into services and extras between these two brands. Now, what is there that I can tell you about WD Red Pro and WD Red as a whole that I haven't already talked about on the channel? NASware 3.0. Fantastic NAS firmware, updated regularly, and it, across their drive you will notice the firmware revisions on drives over their lifespan. You see a lot more improvements in NASware, more than pretty much any NAS hard drive firmware that I've ever seen in the last few years. Vibration sensitivity, fast reactive spin up, spin down, a better power monitoring system for with regards to idle and activity, hence those great figures from earlier on. There's a lot going on. It's not just a basic hard drive. It is designed for large-scale NAS environments where heat, power consumption, vibration, and access is so fantastically variable and constant that you got to give them props for that. And there's a reason WD, you know, up until maybe recently with stuff with SMR, they were still, you know, king of the castle for a long time. Now, Synology, based on that Toshiba architecture underneath them, still bring new stuff to the party. I've already touched on it there. The idea that the firmware on these drives is Synology geared. If you are using a Synology system, that is going to be desirable. And they do highlight on their product pages and data sheets that this does allow them to eke that little bit more to get that improvement in performance from these drives within these relatively hyperscale Synology environments there. Now, I mentioned that business about firmware because there's one thing the Synology brand has talked about there that I'm very much on board with. And that is that the firmware of these drives can be updated from within DSM. Now, let's dig into that because it's actually a bigger deal than a lot of people think it is. Firstly, when you get hard drives, they come with a firmware on board and you can update firmware of any drive. It's not, you know, when it comes to Synology drives, they're not the only company out there that have got hard drives that have got firmware on it that can be updated. But the process of updating firmware on a hard drive, if you've ever done it yourself, and particularly on NAS hard drives, it's a right old pain for the most part. Now, when you get a hard drive, normally in a RAID array, you've got 4, 8, 12, whatever number of bays. When you update the firmware, unless you're using some more open-ended NAS platforms, generally updating the internal firmware either requires a dedicated app in the application center or the NAS brand to have a more free access to that of the information on a drive and the firmware installation within their storage manager. Not all NAS brands have that. So you end up having to power down your NAS, remove drives one by one, and either connect them to a docking station, to a PC Linux, or maybe even Mac system, or on bulk, the bulk dock station there, and then use third-party client applications installed for Windows and more to update the firmware. You know, Seagate's Toolkit there, classic example to allow you to update the firmware on a hard drive. It takes a little bit of time and you have to do it individually, one drive at a time. And again, it's a bit of a nerve-wracking process to remove a drive, stick it in a dock, or, you know, connect it via a SATA and a power cable to a PC, and then update the firmware and not thinking, my God, if that drive fails. Of course, you're going to have a backup, but it's still a bit nerve-wracking there. And again, you're going to be powering down your NAS, you're going to reintroduce these drives, and there's a, you know, a substantial degree of downtime depending on the scale of the drive numbers that you are dealing with. The reason it's such a big deal to be able to update that within DSM is because, one, you won't need to remove the drives. No hands-on bare metal there. Two, when you're updating the firmware, of course, they are going to have to remove the RAID system from access, the storage. You're not going to allow a user to interact with the NAS freely if a drive is going to have its firmware updated. Maybe they'll factor that into the, you know, RAID handling and storage management of DSM-7, but I think that's moderately unlikely. I think it's more likely that when updating the firmware, it's going to be done automatically by the NAS system with each drive. It will check all of the drives and say all of these drives can have their firmware updated, and it will be done without the system having to power down. It will simply do it internally on the drive media. Yes, it'll have to, you know, perhaps remove the storage pool, therefore limiting access to the volumes, and maybe this is something they'll address, but still, nonetheless, it will save a lot more time and a lot more hands-on stuff than using the alternatives that I've just described. Secondly now this one is one that a lot of people overlook, and that is that all the hard drives in your NAS system may not be, right now, the same firmware. Maybe you did buy all of your 8, 12, 16 drives on the same day, but not all drives come from the same batches. Sometimes you have retailers that will give you drives from multiple batches in case there is a bad batch. Alternatively, you may get drives 4 on day one and a few years down the line expand your RAID with more drives. Consequently, it's actually a lot more common than you would think to have drives in a system with different firmware. So the ability to be able to upgrade them all within DSM is very, very advantageous. And I do think it does make a very convincing case to have drives from a brand inside its own first-party NAS system. And that's something I've not really seen from any other NAS brand currently. Of course, it does lead to that point once again that the drives that you're putting inside your NAS system, they're kind of, your hands are a bit tied warranty-wise, in that if you are installing these Synology NAS drives inside a Synology system, you're laughing, but you can't use them in anything else. And for me, that's going to be the big coin toss for a lot of people. When these drives were first announced, even a casual look at websites like Reddit or subforums, or a fantastic article, or a German website, I'll try and link to it in the description below, where they actually got hands-on with these drives and did a bunch of testing there and kind of addressed some of the stuff there about the exclusivity of Synology drives and the Synology platform. But still, nonetheless, it certainly ruffled some feathers there, and I think a lot of people who are on pre-existing WD Red Pro platforms may be slightly hesitant to make the jump over. But in summary, looking between these drives, I do think Synology have made a compelling case for producing their own series of drives. I'm not completely in love with the idea of a system locking out non-Synology drives, as they seem to be doing with the 21 series there, with RP, XS, UC, etc. But it has to be said that these drives do seem to bring a data center quality at a price that I would associate with just large NAS storage. And between them, I'm going to reserve any full judgment until I've physically got the Synology drives here in front of me and we can do those extensive testing. But a quick look at the data sheets alone, at least it gives us the idea that these are a drive worth considering, and they are worth keeping on your radar. If not in future, then very much keep an eye on when you have your next upgrade purchase. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this. We will be doing more comparisons, not only at the moment on a spec level between the Synology HAT5300 and other NAS drive brands, but on top of that, we'll of course be doing more hands-on bare metal testing as the year progresses. And do check out the links in the description, where I've talked a lot about, or we talk about not only this comparison, but these drives themselves and where we think we're going to be going from here. Otherwise, click like if you've enjoyed this video, click subscribe to learn more, and I will see you next time.